This is Dr. Fox. Thank you all for your continued support for CRPN and CRPN Central. For more information about our mission, please contact us today at info@crpainnet.com for details.
Welcome to the conference, brought to you by Globo.
I cannot wait for this conference. I heard they have awesome parties and exciting discussions, and there are just so many people to meet. Best conference ever!
Check out our special site survey brought to you by Globo Crow. Boy, it looks like our sites are really hurting out there.
I'm so glad they're asking these questions. I mean, someone needs to. I really didn't realize how bad it was for our sites. We need to do something.
This panel will discuss broken industry contracts. Please welcome to the stage our Globo Crow conference sponsors. They know exactly what our sites need.
I'm so glad I'm with other people who get it. These conversations need to be happening.
We absolutely must change the system to help our sites. Better payments, more trials, and higher profits. Brought to you by Globo Crow.
Yes, we totally do. Now, yes, a little louder for the back. Preach.
Check out Globo Crow's sponsor booth for some amazing swag and business cards.
I heard Globo Crow has some of the best swag. I can't wait to get a coffee cup and one of those lip balms and, ooh, that little fidget toy. Oh, my family is going to love me.
That meal was fabulous. Thank you to Globo Crow for such an awesome experience.
They really went all out. It makes me feel so special. Thanks, Globo Crow.
And the winner of the site favorite Sierra Award goes to Globo Crow!
Oh, wow. Globo Crow. I haven't had the best experience with them, but they did provide an awesome dinner.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us this year at the conference. Before you leave, make sure that you stop by our booth and ensure that you lock in for next month's conference, sponsored by Globo Crow, at a special rate.
That was awesome. I mean, there's no way I can afford another conference for a year, but I can't wait to come back to see what they do next year.
1 year later.
Welcome to the conference, brought to you by Globo Crow.
Another Global Crow conference. I wonder how much they paid.
Check out our special site survey brought to you by Globo Crow. Boy, it looks like our sites are really hurting out there.
So sites are still hurting pretty bad. Well, maybe the panels will talk about what we're going to do about it.
This panel will discuss broken industry contracts. Please welcome to the stage our Globo Crow conference sponsors. They know exactly what our sites need.
Okay, so same people on the panel as last year. Interesting. And all conference sponsors. Well, what about all the other voices in our industry?
We absolutely must change the system to help our sites. Better payments, more trials, and higher profits. Brought to you by Globo Crow.
This sounds familiar, like deja vu from last year. What's changed?
Check out Globo Crow's sponsor booth for some amazing swag and business cards.
We could use some more lip balm for sure. I mean, I also kind of wonder what they're doing differently for our sites this year.
That meal was fabulous. Thank you to Globo Crow for such an awesome experience.
I wish they didn't play that music so loud. My ears are killing me. Still, the food wasn't bad for catering.
And the winner of the site favorite Sierra Award goes to Globo Crow!
Global Crow, again. Weren't there any other options? I mean, it's funny. They're also the main conference sponsor, huh? Coincidence?
Thank you, everybody, for joining us this year at the conference. Before you leave, make sure that you stop by our booth and ensure that you lock in for next month's conference, sponsored by Globo Crow, at a special rate.
I'm not exactly sure what I got out of this conference. I mean, it was awfully expensive for another swag bag and some lip balm and business cards that will never follow up with me.
1 year later.
Welcome to the conference, brought to you
Yeah,
by
super sponsor Global Crow. I wonder if it's as innovative as it was last year.
Check out our special site survey brought to you by Globo Crow.
Let me guess.
Boy,
Survey
it looks
says
like our
sites
sites
are
are really hurting
hurting.
out there.
Surprise, surprise. Wonder what they're actually going to do about it.
This panel will discuss broken industry contracts. Please
Another
welcome to the
Global
stage
Crow
our
filled
Global
panel.
Crow Conference
Yeah, I think I'll
sponsors.
skip that one.
They know
The
exactly
agenda is
what
a
our
copy
sites
paste
need.
from last year's. Couldn't they find anyone else to talk?
We absolutely must change the system to help our sites. Better
And
payments,
you've done
more
what
trials,
since
and
last year to
higher
fix it?
profits.
Come on.
Brought to you by Global Crow. Check out Global Crow's sponsor booth for some
Pass.
amazing
I
swag
still have Global
and
Crow
business
swag
cards.
from last year. I think I'm good.
That meal was fabulous.
Turn
Thank
the
you to
music
Globo
down.
Pro for such an
Jeez. I think I'm
awesome
going deaf. And
experience.
this chicken is so dry.
And the winner of the site favorite Sierra Award
Let me
goes
guess.
to Globo Crow!
Hey, it was awesome to see you again. Will you be here next year?
You know, after 3 years, I think I'm done going to these conferences. They're way too expensive, and I really don't get much out of them anymore.
Yeah, I understand. Honestly, I go to these because my company pays for it. If I had to pay out of pocket, I probably wouldn't be able to afford it.
I just wish there was a research conference that was more than a trade show.
Hopefully someday we will see an affordable option for those coordinators who can't make it to the pricey shows.
Conferences, environments designed to bring like-minded people together for like-minded and innovative conversations. Clinical research has its share of conferences turned trade shows. However, I'm not quite sure what they have accomplished over the past decade, except for the ability to host even more trade shows. Sites. Trade shows are critical to your business cycles. Attend them. Get your next opportunities and grow your businesses. You'll find, however, that eventually your topics are highly commercialized and recycled from year to year. Conference owners, you've created an ecosystem of community and friendship in our industry. Please keep doing what you are doing. You are amazing at it. And please understand that in an industry as complex and stratified as this one, you can't possibly be everything for everyone. As we begin to discover expansion of conference types across the clinical research industry, let's respect each other's core missions and work together to enhance the site environment. Whether you prioritize margins and experiences or progress and innovation, we are all working toward the same exact thing: to develop a lasting community that is working diligently to empower clinical research sites to better serve our industry, our sponsors, and importantly, our patients. Welcome to CRPN Central, the official podcast of the Clinical Research Payment Network. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Fox. CRPN Central discusses the real issues with our clinical research industry to explore and identify mutually beneficial solutions for all of our stakeholders. Clinical research site conferences are prominent in our industry, with site-centric advocacy that has been active for over a decade. And yet, we continue to experience challenges today that are no different, if not worse, now from where they were when sites began to speak up. How do we establish a clinical research conference that promotes positive innovations that change the industry's site standards for better research experiences? Today, we will discuss clinical research conferences in our industry, defined as the formal meetings or gatherings of professionals who are dedicated to the comprehensive discovery, development, and assessment of therapeutics, devices, data analytics, or the logistical solutions for the advancement of societal healthcare. First, we will speak with two site-level advocates who have started their own grassroots conference dedicated to our front lines. Then, we will speak with an experienced conference organizer who is creating meaningful meeting environments with everything that he creates. To maintain valid comparisons, both interviews will use the same questions, and my guest did not know the questions before the interview. We will reconvene after the interviews to compare answers and perhaps identify the optimal characteristics we may implement for a effective and progressive industry conferences. Our first two guests are well known in the online and site advocacy industry. Brad Hightower of Hightower Clinical and Note to File podcast, and Dan Sfera, the clinical trials guru himself, are two of the most well-known site advocates in the industry. After years of frustration with our professional gatherings, Brad, Dan, and I have come together to form the Save Our Sites Alliance, a conference built by the front lines for the front lines. Brad and Dan are excellent voices in our community research sites, and I'm so thankful they are taking the time to join us today. Please welcome with me Mr. Brad Hightower and Mr. Dan Sfera. Dan Sfera, Brad Hightower, thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central today.
Good morning, boys. I'm losing my voice a little bit, so bear with me.
Could each of you introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm a site owner almost since birth, but in reality, since birth from the university system. First job out of college, actually, even during college. Lucky enough that my dad was a PI. I never worked for him necessarily, but he had a group of doctors that had a clinic, and I went in there to get a good looking resume for med school, and then I never left. That's my story.
What about you, Brad?
Yeah, I mean, sort of fell into clinical research accidentally as almost like a third career almost. Hated it at first, eventually fell in love with it, and started my own sites, and that's where we are today.
I'm kind of the same way. I was a PhD track. I wanted to go to medical school. That didn't happen. I went into MPH. Then MPH happened, and then I went into basic science. Went from basic science to translational research. Got my postdoc on a military base, and I've done some form of clinical research, whether it's been manufacturing, patents, patent law, administration, contracts ever since. So it's interesting how we all have different paths to do in clinical research. And I think that we find that a lot whenever we talk to people. Everyone just kind of falls into clinical research through a different pathway. Today, we're going to talk about conferences in the research industry. I'm going to ask a series of questions. We've got another interviewer lined up to talk about the conferences, and we're going to compare your answers to this other interviewer's answers, and we're going to see if maybe we can find the secret sauce that can really make good conferences in this research industry. Have you ever attended conferences in the industry?
Yes. That's an affirmative, Dr. Fox. None of them are good, and I don't want to bash them all. But the thing is, we can start with the price, and then we can just eliminate the price, and they're still not good. Even if they were free or close to free, if you distill the elements of basically every conference I've been to in life sciences, it boils down to, did you meet cool people? Did you have fun for something that was not part of the official thing? And I'm always thinking, why not make it part of the official thing? The networking aspect. And then there's the learning aspect. There's been topics I was excited to go to at conferences, like, oh wow, let me go in here and listen to what they say. Then they just throw out cliches like, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Well, no shit. Why did I come all the way here for this? I already know this. We need to get into specifics, actionable stuff. So they're very good if you're a beginner and know nothing. Like me, when I go to biotech stuff, they get into the science. Maybe it's the same issues there for the insiders, but for me as a semi-outsider, it is interesting because I'm learning something different. But for us insiders, I know we could do better. There's actual tips and tricks of the trade that are living in people's heads that are rarely shared. And maybe you have a moment here or there, and we wanted to make an entire event where there's just a steady stream of this consciousness.
What about you, Brad?
I had a period more towards the beginning of my career where I went to quite a few conferences, and then for a long gap, I didn't go. And just recently, I've kind of started hitting up conferences again. I think it's interesting, and sort of to Dan's point, sort of the value proposition is different for me now than it was back then, where in the beginning, it's like I didn't know anything. There really wasn't a way to learn very much aside from going to some of these conferences. Things have changed a lot. There's a lot of people creating content and talking about these things in a public forum. And if you're sort of tuned into that, then some of this educational value declines, if that makes sense, because I can go read a thread about negotiating budgets and contracts and probably learn maybe more than what someone on a stage is going to tell me in 20 minutes. I do think it's a little different. To Dan's point, it's also was easy when I worked for like a big institution who wanted to foot the bill, but when you're on your own, you don't want to pay these exorbitant amounts that are basically helping fund these professional conference throwers at this point.
I was in the very similar situation when I was fresh to the industry. Oh, let's go to this conference, pick the brains of the professionals. The first year was like the honeymoon. It was great. So much progress. You learn so much. You talk to people. You just get this high when you're at the conference. Second year comes in, you definitely have a diminishing return. And then by the third year, not only do you have a diminishing return, but it also feels sometimes like it's recycled. You've heard this before. You can almost see the cycle that is being formed. Granted, there are values behind them. People go for networking just to be present in the industry. People want to be seen, they want to be known, but I'm feeling very similar frustrations in the situation. Walk me through the clinical research conference circuit from start to finish.
The cycle seems to be every month there's a dozen to choose from. Some lesser known, others very popular. The three key stakeholders, sites, sponsors, CRO, vendors, I guess, throw them in there. If you wanted to do nothing but go to conferences every month, you could. You could justify your existence as a professional by saying, yeah, I'm going out and doing biz dev. And maybe that is the way to do biz dev for some of these larger budget organizations. What it boils down to is I have not seen the site advocates. I've seen organizations start out to be site advocates and over the years morph into something else that was venture capital backed. That's a little bit less pure of a site advocate, if at all, but maintain the appearance of being site advocates. You need to follow the money in these things, and when it comes to the cycles, it's obvious when you think about it who owns this conference. If you're going to a conference, who owns it? And if you're having a hard time figuring out the key stakeholders that own it, they probably don't want you to know. And then you got to think, okay, well, who's sponsoring it and what's their purpose for existing? I haven't seen any conference like ours where it's just upfront. The founders have been talking to you one-on-one before we even started the conference, and now we're just organizing ourselves to do so.
You could literally just follow the money and almost predict what the content's going to be like just by understanding who's going to be footing the bill. So what about you, Brad?
I can't keep up just from the outside. Can't imagine the people who are on the road constantly. And we know some of these people who are constantly at conferences, and there's probably some value for sure. But at this point, I can't keep up. And you start to maybe see them as little buckets. You've got your ACRP, SOCRA, Magi, which are sort of site focused, I guess SCRS as well. You've got your basically trade shows disguised as conferences, maybe not disguised, maybe they're just are what they are. But I think to Dan's point, a lot of it's that, as we talked about this a year ago, lacking that true site advocacy that's become more co-opted by the sponsor side.
Do you ever feel like there's like a dual incentive for these conference organizers to keep the price high? Not only does the conference owner have an incentive to keep prices high, but the attendees in a weird way also do too. Because if you can control where the deal flow is happening, if you're a startup and you have funding, you don't actually want that price low, because now you're keeping the startups that maybe don't have as good funding, but maybe they have better ideas or even a better team from coming.
Keeping out all the riffraff by keeping the price high so that
The whole country club theory, you have to gain a financial barrier to access. That way you filter out all the people who don't necessarily have money.
I think there's some of that going on too. This is why you haven't really heard the attendees complaining necessarily. But at the site level, and even some of these other conferences that are site focused, there is this level of elitism from some of the sites that attend, like, oh, well, we're members and we go every year and we're sponsored this Golden Eagle that. Yeah, okay, you can humble brag that you're so good you can afford these things like it's nothing to you. The long tail of sites out there are unheard and underrepresented.
For example, I know when Brad came out and he bought some tickets for people at sites who had never been to a conference before, they're so excited because they actually have an opportunity. The barrier is low. It's a very good environment for them to talk about things. And as a result, we're going to have fresh people bringing their ideas to the conference. What do you think are the theoretical benefits of today's research conferences?
recently, I mean, I feel like it has been more of the networking and relationships made. If you're early in your career, some of these are great. There's a lot of information for you and you will learn, but I think it's sort of still fairly entry level, most of the ones I sit in on. And you get one person's perspective for 20 minutes at a lecture. It's a little homogenous. I don't know. I think conferences they want to make money. That's why they're sponsored insanely. It's too much. Like you've got 12 tracks in 2 days. You can't even possibly go to all the things that you would want to learn from. You're kept busy constantly.
What about you, Dan?
It's the biz dev from the organization to organization, B2B. Sites are the only ones that do B2C, which is straight to the customers, which happen to be the patients. So it's all organizational ROI. What is my ROI? It's a different dynamic at the site level. I think sites want to keep studies for themselves. That's the main reason why they go. In our case, because it's such a low price to get in, you get some education for your staff out of it too, like some real education.
And then maybe there's a little more staff morale, like they're feeling valued because you're sending them somewhere.
Ours do. We ran it at Airbnb for the staff, and they're pumped.
So I know when you go in there, like kind of like what Brad was saying as far as tracks go. The tracks are you've got this general agenda. Everyone comes together a few times to talk about ground rules or follow up. You've got a main stage or keynote speaks. You've got breakout sessions. You have sponsors. You have the side talks. And then, of course, you have evening drinks and dinners. A lot of biz dev, a lot of swag, a lot of promotion with some garnishes of content here and there. I think that it's really, really good for networking, for brand development, for introducing yourself to the industry, for making a presence, but I'm not necessarily sure if it's going to get anything done. What do you think are the shortcomings of our current research conferences? I've talked about cost. I'll just throw cost out there right now. How much do you think people have to pay just to go?
I think it's a couple grand as an attendee, and then they try to sell you on the member so you can get like 20% off or something.
The big one is if you're not a member, it's $1,900 just to register. And if you are a member, it's $995. And then if you want to go to the hotel that they select, you have to pay a group rate of sorts, but it's still easily a couple grand for the hotel. Then you've got, of course, airlines. And if you can get your airlines in place early, you might be paying another $1,000 plus your ground transport. 3 to 6, do you think?
Yeah, that's
probably right.
That's about the going rate. It's like 2 grand, 3 grand.
Let's just say at 3 to 6,000, that's a pretty big range. And sometimes even if you go to some of them, it's 7, 8, whatever it might be.
Oh, easily.
What do you think is the average coordinator's monthly salary?
Well, there's the national average is 65K a year. If we break that down, it's about 5K a month gross.
Yeah.
I follow your logic. These are not ROI to send your coordinators. Not to mention the fact that they're not in the clinic seeing patients.
Lost business opportunity.
Yeah, and it's the talkers that go to these things, not the doers. And the talkers can say whatever they want. It doesn't matter because when you go back to the office and you tell your lead CRC, hey, we're doing this, and she says, no, we're not, and here's why, all that shit that you learned that you got excited about goes out the window.
So what about you, Brett? So what do you think are some of the shortcomings of the industry's current conferences?
First of all, it's really apparent that a lot of them are peppered with sponsored talks. I can't tell you, I went to a conference recently and I'm like, this is a commercial. This is a 40-minute commercial for this company. You're not actually saying anything. So, they wheel out some doctor with a lot of credentials behind their name. They've got like a seemingly innocent, generic title to their presentation. But then from slide 2, you're like, oh, you were just advertising your company to everyone. This is a joke.
By the way, a doctor that's probably never touched a patient in their lives, or if they have, they're like decades removed from doing that.
Yeah.
Because they're on the speaker circuit. So even if you send your PI there, there's like no respect because the PI sees the clinic.
Yep.
Right.
They see the patients. They told me when I go to these things, I know it's bullshit because I see the truth every day treating patients. The truth is not on that stage talking to you because they have the alphabet after their name. The truth is like what you see day to day, hour to hour in your clinic. That's the truth.
Another one is that some of these conferences have gotten so big and so long that they're just like desperate for people to come talk about something to fill up the space. And then pretty soon the talks are so oddly specific that you're like, who could this possibly apply to? It's like not generalizable. Who cares about this? I get that obviously people do, but if you have a 3.5 or 4 day conference and you have 8 hours a day and there's 12 rooms of people speaking, you got to start making shit up after a while.
Yeah, just to keep feeding the beast.
Well, I was going to say, because you got more sponsor money, the longer it is, the more you can charge, and it just becomes so watered down and diluted with advertising and then pointless talks that the value just diminishes very quickly.
Always boils down to, well, it's for the patients. It's patient centricity. This is to help the patients. This is to improve access in the communities. It's always shrouded in something that's good that no one can argue with. But then when you look under the hood, you're like, well, wait a minute. This is not actually good, nor do I actually think this will ever work.
If you ever go to a conference and you go to those breakout sessions, look at the panel. And odds are the people on the panel are also sponsors because they paid to sit in that panel.
Yeah.
Look at that panel and ask one question. Have you ever consented a patient in the past year? And see how many people say, Yay or nay? Odds are, nope. They're so far disconnected from the patient that I'm not saying it discredits them. I know that they've earned what they are and I know that they're experienced, but maybe they shouldn't necessarily be talking on behalf of the front lines.
Oof. Generally, the loudest ones representing an organization, they're the ones furthest removed from doing. Even at Yuma Clinical Trials, my site, I'm the face of it. And I'm probably the most removed from any of the workers there. And I still get in the trenches because you can't do both things well. You can't be the face and be the best worker. This is how organizations work. If you're going to be on this conference circuit talking, your business has to be working somehow. There's people that are not there doing the work.
Someone has to pay to send you.
Exactly. You're just distilling ideas. But that doesn't mean they're pragmatic. That doesn't mean they're going to take off because the people that are not there are the ones that are going to tell you, good idea, Dan, but nah, we're not going to do that. And here's why. And they're right.
What about you, Brad? Have you consented a patient in the past year?
I have, yeah. And like Dan, I'm not nearly as involved as I was even a year ago at my site. I still jump in. I draw blood here and there mostly, more than anything else. I mean, yeah, it's tough because I feel kind of what you said, Dr. Fox, that obviously a lot of these people have earned their spots and earned some respect along the way throughout their careers, but we see it happen time and time again. The further disconnected you get, the more disconnected you get, right? You have no idea anymore. And so that's very easy for us to point out in our positions because while we're a little bit disconnected, we're still fairly connected to what's going on the ground.
Oh,
To Sfera's point, it's all sort of umbrellaed under this, but it's patient centricity. How could you possibly argue with patient centricity? How dare you? Are you against patient optionality? And like, no, but you're too disconnected to understand what's practical.
yeah. Just because you think something's patient centric doesn't actually mean it is really. Just because you say so and some alliance came together and put their three heads together and said, yeah, this is for sure what we got to do, doesn't mean that's the solution.
It's true. And honestly, I mean, this is where I think what I would love to see at our conference is people who are not us who are talking. It's not just about us. We talk enough, all three of us. People have heard plenty from us, people who are even closer to the ground and people who are even more with their hands on the button, so to speak, should be there and should be talking.
How do we create a conference that can actually create lasting change for our research site industry? That is the very first point to put on there is put the front lines on stage. Let them speak. Understand from them what's going on.
You want to talk about decentralization? That's exactly what this is flipping that pyramid upside down. I mean, we were very selective about who's speaking on these panels. We specifically went out of our way to make sure they're people that are lesser heard from, people you may have never heard about, the actual workers. This is who we want to hear speak the true decentralization of idea flow, rather than just pushing an idea from the top, forcing everyone to implement it. Here's actual solutions that we use every day to get around all the bullshit that's been created by think tanks and whatnot. And these are the people doing it. And these are the ways that we're actually getting patients in studies, staying in studies, and running our sites so that we can continue to serve the communities. That's patient centricity. And oftentimes, there's nothing fancy to sell people. It's just practical know-how.
Yeah, I would echo that 100%. A lot of the most effective things are not anything fancy and shiny and investable. Coordinators, at least in my experience and with my team, they want to learn. They want to know. They want to have opportunities like this. But the current state of things makes it to where these conversations are so impractical that even if you go, you don't really walk away learning anything actionable. We can be different.
It brought me back to my college days writing college papers. They required you to provide primary sources, not secondary, not tertiary sources, but the primary sources in your references. Primary sources being the story coming straight from the person who experienced it. Secondary is more like a biography, like you interviewed someone and you told their story. And by the time you get to tertiary, where it's been so digested, it's kind of a lost cause. It feels almost like the conferences that we have right now are primarily tertiary experiences that are being shared. It's not coming straight from the voice of the person experiencing it. And maybe that could be the difference that you would need to create a good conference that can make a difference, is to bring in those primary voices.
Well said. I think so. They use polls and surveys that are carefully curated and clearly suffers from selection bias to sites that are on board, that they can make the results consults appear to be whatever they want to further their agenda. But when you're actually talking to the real sites that are never invited to these polls, because first of all, very few people even know about these sites, you'd get completely different answers. That's very well articulated, Dr. Fox.
Thank you. If I were to hand each of you the microphone and I just said, what would you like to tell this industry about clinical research conferences and where they are now and where you'd like to see them go, what would you tell them?
The current offering of clinical trial conferences are not representative or beneficial to sites as a whole. Sites are not properly represented, and this is what we're trying to change. This is why we're doing this. We wanted to create something that's sort of not tainted by over corporate sponsorship, isn't sort of bought in and paid for by the pharma side and industry side, and something that is truly sort of grassroots for and by sites. We're showing that, I mean, it's something people want. There's obviously a lot of interest in this, and this is just year one, and we're seeing, overwhelming response. I hope that sites will attend. They'll be a part of this movement. We are seeing sites' voices being heard more and more. And again, I hope that we can have some impact on making things better for all of us.
Dan, what do you think?
I think we need sites to be successful. Sponsors, I understand they want to control end to end of their biz dev and supply chain, and that includes site management. And I think the CROs for the last few decades have been tasked with that responsibility. And I think we're at an interesting point in time where the CROs are losing some of that ability to control, especially when at the same time we're wanting more diversity of study participants. And we know that the status quo is giving us a certain type of patient archetype in our studies. And so we actually need more awareness, more sites that are not part of the status quo. And we need to make actionable value props for these sites to come and learn and manage their businesses successfully so that sponsors can get those patients that they want in their studies. Research naive, diverse, and everything they're looking for. Long gone, I hope, are the days where sponsors think they can control the whole end-to-end process of site management vis-a-vis the CROs. And I think they're starting to wake up to that realization, and I think it's exciting times.
True. Grassroots. Try to get away from the corporate. Try to bring the voice to the sites, to the people on the front lines who are doing it. And as a result, maybe we can actually create a good conference experience to help people to have better companies, better organizations, and overall a better industry. Brad, Dan, thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you. We'll see you guys in Tucson.
See you guys. Thank you, Fox.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
All right. Our next guest is an experienced founder and one of the best event quality professionals I have ever met. Jeff Smith is the co-founder of Smith & Jones Innovation, an organization founded specifically to create empowering and innovative environments for successful and stimulating professional conferences. Jeff is an exceptional expert in the event sector, and I am so thankful he has taken the time to speak with us today. Please welcome with me Mr. Jefferson Smith. Mr. Jefferson Smith, thanks so much for coming on to CRPN Central today.
Jeff is fine. It's great to be here.
Jeff, could you introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Jeff Smith, itinerant conference planner, helping with the Innovation Network and now with Save Our Sites conference. Previously was a co-founder of a clinical research software company with a successful exit last year. I'm an accidental traveler. I hadn't thought that this is what we'd be doing. After selling the company, founding CEO of the acquiring company, and I were talking about how I could be useful. It seemed like one thing was getting people together to anticipate and shape the future of the sector. We started our company just before COVID, but there was obviously a time of significant change, or at least significant analysis, questioning, self-reflection, organizationally speaking. How is the world going to change? How is it not going to change? And such an obvious need for modernization within not only all of healthcare, but clinical research, clinical trials very specifically. And we had the idea of doing the Innovation Network gathering. When we started it out, it was really not because that's what I wanted to do. It's because it seemed like something needed to happen. I mean, you've been to conferences, you go to these things, and you have all these brilliant people, and you take all the brilliant people and you put them in the basement of some hotel, and you put the panel in front of some group with fluorescent lighting and not great sound and not real speaker prep, and maybe one C-SPAN camera, and then you hope everybody's enjoying themselves, but really they're kind of waiting for the happy hour, waiting to go to the sponsor booths. And how could we harvest and harness harness all that talent that's there for something that mattered a little more, that was a little more human. And not to knock those conferences, I thought they were impressive logistical feats, but how could we really try to have something to show for the time that people are spending? And maybe it wouldn't be as big, maybe there wouldn't be as many people there, but maybe we'd put more energy and time per person and give a production that was worthy of the ideas and the people gathered. Recruited an old friend of mine who's been running TEDx conferences for the last 12 years. And I comes from academia, who'd started her own college, and she had an opening because that shut down in the middle of COVID. And so there was a window where a talented person could be recruited. She and I have, as it happens, done events for much of our lives. Neither of us really consider ourselves event planners. I think that's some of the value that we add. We've run organizations and we've helped startups and growth organizations tell their stories and scale up and raise money and find customers. And we've built nonprofit organizations. We have sort of a varied skill set. At the same time, we really care about the experiences that people have in an event. We think that those experiences matter. Basically, focused in areas of complexity where there are barriers to entry, figuring out how you can connect the needs of a complex industry to an experience that will actually matter in that industry and for those attendees. That's a hard problem.
Today's topic is clinical research conferences, the experience that we have in clinical research conferences now versus maybe some of their challenges. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I've asked these questions to another set of interviewers. Afterwards, we're going to take those answers that you provide and we're going to analyze them to maybe figure out some similarities, some alignments, some best practices that perhaps we could consider when it comes to developing complex industry conferences.
Great.
Have you attended these complex industry conferences?
Sure. Not as many as I would like. And each time I go to one, I learn something, but sure.
Could you walk me through the clinical research conference circuit from start to finish?
Sure. We had a company and we were newer to the industry. And so we really needed to build connections within it. And we needed to learn stuff and find a path to market, et cetera. So we would plan in advance. We asked, hey, which are the best ones? We would ask around, what are the places with the neatest people where there's the best chance to interact? And it reminded me of what we used to call the Radway rule. It's named after a guy named Mike Radway, who was on my board of directors years ago. One time he said, people enjoy events in direct proportion to the amount that they get to talk. I've always remembered the Radway rule, and I realized it was an application. We didn't want to go only where we would learn. We wanted to go where we could pitch. There would usually be some sort of platform, some sort of thing in advance where there's a chance maybe to interact with people, find out who's going. You try to find the list in advance. Maybe they have an interactivity platform that maybe some percentage of people get into. More of the people who do it were people like me who weren't looking to buy, but looking to sell. So you end up being kind of vendor to vendor. And then you go and you're prioritizing your time. And what you're really wanting to do is build relationships. And this is what I found interesting. What I was actually looking for was authentic connection. I was looking to find a human being that has shared purpose with me because I didn't actually have something in my backpack that I was going to hand out and get a few dollars for. What I was actually trying to do was find Aristotelian friends of the good. Aristotle says 3 kinds of friends: friends of pleasure, friends of mutual benefit, and friends of the good, with whom you share a deep objective with, some joint purpose. That's the highest form of friendship, according to Aristotle, and I tend to agree. Ultimately, that's what I was looking for. So I would look for conferences that might offer some chance to either have some of those people or have a chance to interact with those people if there were. So when you show up, you go to their smaller group meetings and their bigger group meetings, and you go and you listen, and that's one major portion. And then a second major portion is kind of the sponsor booth area where you go in and kind of the display, kind of trade show format where you go around and walk among the booths and get cards. And I'm going to call it the community portion. That's not usually what it's called. And I think it's something that can be done with greater intentionality, but that's the happy hour. It's the meals. Very often it is that interstitial space, that time in between, that liminal space where a lot of the best things happen. And you go there for some number of days. Sometimes you stay out too late, so you miss stuff in the morning, and then you head home.
I've had similar experiences. It's sign up online. Sometimes there's some pre-survey, something that they'll do with it. Most of the time, you just kind of fly blindly to the conference, find yourself into the hotel room, the registration desk. Sometimes there's signage. Sometimes you just have to guess or ask the hotel front lobby. You get there, you get a registration. They want to register, give you your name badge, your little swag bag, and then they kind of turn you loose. There you are. You have to make a decision. You could go this way for the sponsor booths. You could go that way for the big events. You could go to the dive teams. It's kind of like the wild, wild west of trying to network for your own professional development. What do you think are the benefits of today's research conferences as they are?
There are incredible people who go to them, who are working on incredibly important things. There are so many people who are linked by a shared passion to do their small part to make the world a tiny bit better. Speaking for myself, I am not going to cure cancer, and I am still angry at cancer. I've been angry at cancer cancer ever since my mom diagnosed with it and died from it when I was in high school. And I know that I will not be able to exact vengeance in my lifetime. But if I can do a small thing to help somebody else who's smarter than I am, then that feels worth doing.
Going to these conferences, maybe they have these great ideas, they have these wonderful opportunities to make impact, but they don't necessarily have an environment that can enhance what they're trying to do.
Yes and no. I want to be humble. I'm aggressively critical in us trying to do something that will fill a niche and do something better. I also want to be humble in critiquing somebody else's thing because I know they have a hard problem to solve. I can be blisteringly critical at events, including events that I have done. I have yet to give the perfect speech. I have yet to coach the perfect speech, and I have yet to host the perfect event. And I want to be complimentary not only to the people that go and the purpose, but also to even some of the logistics. I have seen some remarkable things, including going to a conference in the middle of COVID and having a tent where everybody got to get their COVID test before they went in. That was a logistical feat. It ain't nothing. It takes skill and it takes resources and it takes measurable amounts of both. And yes, I think that so much of the why and how is answered by the current major conference. Very much of the why and how are both around how do we generate enough revenue to make this worth doing? And how do we get enough people who will be willing to pay enough so that it feels worth doing? And worth doing as a commercial enterprise instead of doing some other commercial enterprise like being a stockbroker. Those pressures yield to several decisions. And I don't throw rocks at these decisions, nor do I throw rocks at the pressures. But that includes high ticket prices, which I totally understand. There's a lot of logistics. That includes lots of people there. That includes trying to get sponsorships and figuring out what sponsors are willing to pay for. And very often what they're willing to pay for is speaker slots and sponsorship booths, chances that they will have commercial benefit and that commercial benefit will be realizable within the jaws of that conference and they'll be willing to pay for it. And then having lots of people who do that. I have friends that own conference companies and I talked about the thing and I asked one of them to share me their sponsorship sheet. And the first one, each of them was like, well, if you want a keynote, it's this much. And if you want a breakout session talk, it's this much. And I totally understand why you do that because ultimately you need to put together 7 figures to run your conference. And that's much of the why and it's much of the how. And I also see costs of that, either gaps that leaves or itches it doesn't scratch or problems that if it doesn't cause, then at least it doesn't solve for. And the simplistic way to say it, the person who is willing and able to pay the fee to have the keynote might not be the person who has the idea we're spreading. And by the way, everybody in the conference gets that. They hear that or they don't hear it. And then very often you have the person who's giving the talk and it's the Mikey from the Life cereal commercial who's the person who's willing to give the talk. I'm not saying they're disappointed to be there, but that idea itself might or might not be the thing about which they are most passionate, the topic about which they are spending their most time, or the biggest thing about which they want to emit their barbaric yawp to the world, the stroke of the symphony that they want to offer the universe. How can you create an economically viable conference that is purpose-driven, that accomplishes real objectives for companies who participate and for organizations who participate who have to live on this earth and pay people wages and report to investors and grow economically, etc., and do it in a way that connects to and speaks to the humanity among us? Because, by the way, that's why we go to conferences.
You are absolutely right. To anyone who thought, I think I could do it better, I can make it cheaper for a conference, I can do all of this, odds are you're not seeing every single cost that it takes to do it. Once you start organizing a conference, you realize how much these things truly cost to perform, even when you just try to break even without collecting a dime. So for that, anyone who's bootstrapped a conference, who's running it right now, you have my highest respects because by far you run it right and I appreciate what you do. The one benefit that our current clinical research conferences do is they allow us to come together to meet each other as human beings. What do you think are the current shortcomings of our current research conference circuit?
I'm not necessarily reinforced in the purpose that united me to going. I have not necessarily connected with other people. I will go and I'll see somebody really smart with something really wonderful to say, and I'll see them give their presentation. See somebody who clearly did not get support in preparing their talk. And I'm not trying to knock their talk. If somebody's a brilliant biologist, why would they be a brilliant communicator? In fact, if they had developed all of their time to become a brilliant communicator, we would wonder if they really were a brilliant biologist. If all they are is a salesperson, are they really a great scientist? So how can we help put that scientist, that person with a data mind, that person who might be an introvert, in a position to help their ideas truly translate and truly land with listeners? When I'd go to the conferences, I would see the work that was done in advance. So much of it was around the logistics. And in terms of the actual ideas that were spread, it felt like there could be more energy into those ideas. Make sure they're connected to a shared purpose. Make sure that that the speakers had the kind of support that would have them really sing, and then also have the people who attend have something to show for it. Something after the conference is different than it was beforehand. A mentor of mine, when I would be planning a meeting and I'd say, hey, we're doing this retreat, what thoughts do you have? And he would always say the same thing to me. He said, Jeff, what do you want different at the end of the meeting than it was before the meeting? And I would say, well, I want to have a meeting that does this, and maybe we cover this topic. I want to make sure people talk. And he says, no. How do you want the world to be different after the meeting than it was before the meeting? But how can we put ourselves in the shoes of the attendee and of the sector at large, of the world at large, and think, how is the world better because this happened? And how are the lives of the people who participate better because it happened? And how is their work better because it happened? And focus ourselves on purpose, focus ourselves on those ideas we're spreading, and focus ourselves on what do we have for show for it? And that includes how do we build community within it?
It sounds like you can go to these conferences and you see potential, true potential, people who are smart, they're intelligent, they're passionate, and maybe they just didn't have the support that they needed to shine. Maybe the structure is not there. I have experienced that as well. Sometimes I've been asked to be a speaker on a panel or a speaker on a webinar, and you get 2 emails, and that's about it. You get an email, hey, do you want to be on this panel? And then, hey, can I have your bio and your picture? And then after that, it's okay, show up at this table. That's about as far as you go.
Yeah.
There may be some limited production that's happening on that end just to try to fill slots. The other part that I resonate with truly is when you said, how do you want the world to change after you've gone to this conference? You really don't see that shortcoming until it's a few years later. The first one's great, honeymoon's there, it's awesome. The second one, you've got a diminishing return. And by the third one, you're already seeing the recycling. You're not really feeling like your time or your money was well spent because there's not really a novel experience. We don't have to worry about that as much for first year SOS, but that's always going to be trailing you afterward.
What a great point. And there's another reason for humility is there's an energy around a first thing and a second thing that is different in the 10th thing. And how do you create something that feels like a tradition while it also feels fresh? So there's a book called Hitmakers. It made the point that all hits are the same. They all have some overlapping traits, whether it's music or products or companies or books. They share 2 things. One is some familiarity. A song that you hear that's a hit song sounds a little bit like something you've heard before. And the second is some adventure, something unfamiliar, something that feels new. So that mixture of familiarity and adventure, it also sort of speaks to our minds, or the combination of our reptilian brain and our frontal lobes. Like we're looking for safety and we're looking for adventure. And then it's around choices. Which are the things that are good enough pieces to be traditions, and which are the pieces that should be changed? And then what are areas of sort of surprise and delight? And it's literally one of the things we're messing with now. So we have a truly A-list logistics planner. He was our first round draft pick, and he wasn't available for 10 years because he was working on another conference. And the reason he became available was because that conference made the decision after 10 years to stop doing it. Not because it was unsuccessful, but because they were conference artists and he was a conference artist. And they said, listen, the 11th year isn't going to be as special. And we have done what we can do with this. And I think it took tremendous courage to end. Now, I'm not saying a conference should only have a 10-year lifespan. I mean, the Super Bowl continues to happen and it continues to be very culturally important. But that is one of the questions that we're wrestling with is, all right, what are the things that stick? What are the things that change? And what does a lifespan mean? Do you set yourself to a purpose that eventually you accomplish? Or do you fill a niche that is not so specifically about a specific objective that niche continues to need to be filled? For instance, with sites, they will probably always need to have a voice. At the same time, what are the things that can refresh themselves over time?
It's really easy, as you said, to invent the bar, to create the bar, but to always have to have a challenging bar, something that is interesting, but something that is familiar at the same time. That's the art. Doing that 10, 20, 50 years for the Super Bowl, that's going to be the true challenge, especially when it comes to the morphing voice of sites. And how do we create a conference that can actually create lasting change for our research industry?
I don't know yet. What I have now is curiosity and hypotheses more than confidence and conclusions. So one of them I've said, which is to organize around purpose and to try to be rooted in a shared purpose. Second, invite people with that in mind, finding the tribe among the tribes, finding the people who are in the sector who who are also not just wishing they were stockbrokers. Third, I've talked about it. Real help to make sure those ideas can spread would be a third thing. Fourth, intentionality with the community building. Now, we need to already have started that by having a purpose to start with and trying to invite people who share that purpose. So people aren't just trying to be friends of mutual benefit or friends of pleasure. They're actually trying to be friends of the good. And then giving some intentionality to that experience so that they interact, so that it's not only big stage to small thing, it's also Radway rule. How do more people get a chance to talk? Fifth, to be intentional about having something to show for it, having some deliverable. Not every little group has to have a deliverable, but it'd be nice if one did. It'd be nice if next time you come back, you can say, well, thanks to the last thing, we're now doing blank. And that is also hard because that's not merely, that is still something I'm working to figure out. Because if you define yourself as a conference, well, then the conference is over. And then what you're working on is the next one. But if you really want something to come of it, there needs to be follow-up. People have to be involved after everybody has their heartfelt goodbyes and the inspiration starts to dissipate and they get back to their lives, go back to their jobs, etc. That fifth one is one that I would genuinely welcome help with.
That was the number one constructive criticism that I received when we announced Save Our Sites. They said, you know, it all sounds really good, but how in the world are you going to instill change with a conference? What are you going to do? Are you going to make people sign a pledge? You're not going to allow them to come to next year's conference unless they do something. How are you actually going to create change when you try to bring people together? You have a really good number of ingredients that, if put together properly, could create an ecosystem of community that could almost feel as though everyone is working together toward a common problem.
The answer that you got, the pushback that you got, the constructive criticism you got. One would be centralized, the second would be sort of medium centralized, and the third would be fully distributed. Let's say there is a question. If the conference is called to, hey, everybody, we are going to solve blank problem, or at least among these, we've decided we're at least going to try to pose one question that we're going to try to get answered between now and the next time we get together, between now and a decade from now, because every conference in the next decade is going to be working at doing that. Second, I said sort of medium centralized, and that's why I like the idea of small groups, because then if you can have small groups that are organized, that are intentional, if you have 10 of those groups and one or two of them come out with something, well, instead of just answering that one central problem, well, now we're up to two or three. And the third is the one that I do want to give credit to conferences generally, that we should be humble about what we expect a conference to do. The conference is different than a company. A conference is different than a nonprofit. A conference is different than a government. A conference is a convening. And much of what a convening can do, and when people say, oh, you know, the best stuff is that liminal space, I actually really like the happy hour. I really like the pre-registration time. I really like meeting the person I didn't expect to meet, or seeing again the person I did expect to meet, or coming up with something I didn't expect I would come up with, or doing something that wasn't planned. That is not accidental. That is intentional. That's kind of why to get together. It's that third part, is that fully distributed thing. It's that connecting and matchmaking that might happen, that might be hard to measure what happens from it, but we know that it exists, and of course it does. There are ways to facilitate that better and maybe even account for it better.
Incremental. We don't have to build Rome in a day. We don't have to fix every problem in a single conference, but we have to show progress somehow. Show progress through documentation, show progress through testimony, show progress through impact. As long as something gets done and it's recordable and it's noticeable and we can justify how we are doing it and what we are doing, and we can continue to improve what we're doing, I think we'll be in the right place. If I were to hand you the microphone right now and I said, what would you like to tell the entire research industry about clinical research conferences, where they are now and where you'd like to see them go, what would you tell them?
Truly value what you are doing and truly value the people who are doing it, and consider how that value can be maximized, including, and maybe even especially, the value that you cannot so obviously and readily monetize, or at least count.
Staying humble, having an understanding for why people do what they do, maybe how things have come the way they are, and maybe in some ways how things have good intention. And if people are feeling frustrations, maybe just put themselves in the shoes of the people who are working so hard to create these events. And then maybe if we do that, we can come together, have an understanding, listen to each other, learn from each other, and create a much better environment for progress in this industry. Jeff, thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central today. I look forward to sharing this with the audience.
Well, Dr. Fox, it was a pleasure to do it. Thanks for what you're doing.
Absolutely. I'll talk to you later.
All right, man. Take care.
All right, bye.
Cheers, man.
Combined, Brad and Dan have decades of experience on our front lines and in advocating for our clinical research sites. Now, as co-founders of the Save Our Sites Alliance, they are creating a grassroots conference that is not tainted by corporate sponsorships to bring the primary voices, our front lines, an environment that allows them to speak candidly and honestly. Current industry conferences are great to meet cool people and to network. However, they are often educational only for the beginners. The conference circuit is saturated with so many events, and it is hard to keep up with the offerings. However, with as many buckets of events that we have in our industry, we continue to lack true site advocacy after we follow the money and realize the long tail of underrepresented sites who can't afford to access these industry country clubs. Research conferences generally feature the talkers, not the doers, and most of the watered down and diluted content boils down to 40-minute commercials presented by disconnected subject matter experts who do not understand how clinical trials truly operate at the site. Conference presentations are often tertiary in sources, and if we offer our front lines and the dedicated professionals who truly want to learn, know, and interact with their industry on stage and listen to them sincerely with an intention to explore solutions, perhaps we may discover the actual solutions that work every day in our industry. Jeff and the Smith & Jones team's sole mission is to develop lasting and memorable professional meetings for complex industries. Conferences are commercial enterprises and often morph into vendor-to-vendor conversations, although they are in fact impressive logistical feats attended by human beings seeking Aristotelian friends of good. Amazing people doing impressive professional feats come to conferences. However, many of the amazing people with the brilliant ideas often cannot afford to pay for the speaker slots conferences must charge to address the why and the how of the industry's commercial needs, which often risks leaving gaps and itches that are not scratched. Those who are speaking at the conferences are often not supported in their presentations and therefore leave the audience unimpressed with under-prepped talks and subpar conference performances. Conferences are often founded out of sincere interest, and the first and second event may be interesting and embraced. However, they must combine traditional familiarity with novel, adventurous content to avoid long-term shortcomings and lifespan longevities. And to create an impactful conference environment, we must organize with purpose, invite like-interested professionals, provide real help to our speaking professionals, intentionally find the friends of the good, and define some form of deliverable to demonstrate long-term progress year over year. All of today's interviewers confirmed the current strengths of today's conferences comprise beginner education and business development, and all of today's interviewers identified significant unmet needs for the industry's experienced professionals. And while Brad and Dan described the conference experience overall as a corporate-sponsored marketing event with watered-down and diluted information, Jeff explained that the commercialization and cost of conferences are the necessary why and how of the conference ecosystem. And similar to Brad and Dan's recommendation to offer a platform for primary sources of perspective, Jeff believes bringing together and properly preparing passionate people to discover mutual friendships of good for intentional conversations creates an ideal meeting environment for impact that will last longer than a long weekend at a conference. So, how do we establish a clinical research conference that promotes positive innovations that change the industry's site standards for better research experiences, although different in their delivery and opinions of the conference industry? All of our interviewers align toward three distinct ideologies. To perform impactful clinical research conferences, we must focus closely on preparation, intentionality, and authenticity. Respect the time of your attendees with well-prepared and planned organic conversations. Ensure the same subject matter experts sharing at the conference are experienced primary sources. Find the difficult balance between affording to operate your events with like-minded sponsors and adhering to the sole purpose of operating your conference in the first place. If we stay humble, convene with our friends of the good, and learn from each other, perhaps we can work together to create progressive and positive change in our industry for years to come. Thank you for listening to today's insightful clinical research conference episode. The conference circuit is a big business, but remember, there really isn't a point in coming together when the experiences are so monetized that we can't even come together as the professionals that we are to discuss the industry's problems. Thank you to Brad, Dan, and Jeff for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you to Mike Surlak, Emily Epstein, Zane Courbay, and Jedd Chang for participating in today's CRP in Short. Finally, thank you to my CRPN sponsors for helping to make this podcast possible. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time on CRPN Central.